fading. Well, good morning everybody, and a very warm welcome to the talk. Thank you all for coming along this sunny morning. This is the Geraldine Goddard Memorial Lecture, and I have a very nice picture over here. I didn't know Jerry, but I certainly know about her legacy because I've been heavily involved with the beneficial effects of it since then. And I'm really pleased to say that two of her sisters are with us today in the front row, and they've come as far as Somerset. Now, apart from the lecture, we are also going to have a more permanent commemoration for Jerry in the library once we've finished our restoration, because it's no exaggeration to say that without her wonderful bequest, none of this would have really happened. So she left us £100,000, which is absolutely extraordinary. So before I go any further, can I just ask you all to think about writing your own wills? I know that at least two people in the room have done it and remembered the Leighton Library, but if you think about what you could have done for Jerry to commemorate her, and go and look at that, and think if you can find a final memorial, I'll challenge you to do it. So it's a wonderful way to remember a loved one, or even yourself if you're feeling that way. Right, now what I'm going to do is a little bit of a history lesson. I'm conscious that I am preaching to the converted a bit, looking at the audience, but not everyone's going to know everything. And I'm going to try and look at it from the perspective of what interests me. I'm particularly interested in history, and I'm really interested in the contents of the library, although I've really been managing the building, and I've learned a lot about historic buildings and archaeology in the process. But I'm going to have a look at the history and the context of the library. I'm not going to cover Leighton's life, which is what one usually does in a talk. And then I'm going to look at 4 bestsellers that I really like. Now, there are 4,700 books in the library, and all of them are fantastic. So I've got more than a lifetime's worth of talks ahead of me, but I'll try a few really extraordinary things, and hopefully stuff you may not know about in the book collection. So we'll start off here with this really fantastic frieze. I don't know if you recognise it. It's from the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, around the hallway. Recommend you go if you've not been in. Fantastic building. But the Edwardians, when they built it, put all the great people of Scottish history on an enormous frieze that goes all the way around. You'll notice the lack of women, for a start. But the reason I put this in is I was there one day and I had a look, and look who's in the middle, at the back, just behind Charles II. And I couldn't believe it, because I hadn't noticed that before. And the reason that I show this slide is that I'm going to just talk about the people in this slide to give us all a bit of a sense of where Leighton sits in Scottish history. Because he was, I don't know if the word fortunate is the right word, but he lived through an extraordinary century, the 1600s, and so 1611 to 1684. You couldn't make it up what extraordinary things happened in Scotland during that period. Extremely violent, extremely political, extremely difficult, and an enormous period of change. And I think at least 3 of the characters up there were executed, so it was quite a risky time to be a prominent person. But if we, I think I've got a pointer that might work. Right, here we are. So the first one here I'll draw your attention to is the Earl of Lothian. Now, he's connected with Leighton because he was actually the heritor at Newbattle Abbey, which was, of course, Leighton's first post as a minister in the Church of Scotland in 1642, I think. So he appears there. We all know who he was and what happened to him. Hardly anybody's heard about Jameson. He was actually a portrait painter and was the key portrayer of the nobility during the period. I think largely forgotten now. This splendid gentleman here is General Leslie, the head of the army of the Covenanters, and then later the head of the Scottish army, who handed him over to Cromwell for his eventual execution. You've then got the Presbyterian Argyll, who never comes out very well in portraits. I don't know if you know any others, but he always looks really miserable. The massively glamorous Montrose, with the best tomb ever in St Giles Cathedral. Now he's connected with us because, of course, he was the brother-in-law of David Drummond in a Peffray. And you can even find his Bible there that has 2 holes in it because he wore it around his neck when he went into battle, and you can see that at the library. But yes, he was the brother-in-law of the Drummonds in a Peffray. You know who that is, and we know who that is as well. And here's another interesting character. This is the Duke of Lauderdale. Now he's going to appear once or twice in my talk because he was essentially a bit of a mercurial character, but he became the Secretary of State for Scotland and essentially ran Scotland on behalf of Charles II, and he didn't want to cross him, and 1 or 2 of our heroes today did cross him. Then we've got, looking, I think, slightly shifty and shoved in the background, James VII. Bonnie Dundee, and he's a bit after our period, but I'll mention him because he was responsible for the massacre of some of my kinfolk. That's the Master of Stair, who signed the order for the massacre of Glencoe. So you can see in this period, that's quite an interesting context in which Leighton operated. And one of the great things about Leighton, and 1 or 2 of the others I'm going to look at, are somehow they managed to survive all this political upheaval without getting the executioner's axe and moving from position to position. Sometimes they were in, sometimes they were out. But it was quite extraordinary how some people managed to survive during that period. So if we have a look, I really like this. You may be familiar with it. It's the Sleazer 1692 picture of Dunblane from the Theatrum Scotii. He did 2 drawings of Dunblane. One was of the cathedral itself with the roof off and the bishop's palace, but then you can see here, there's the bishop's palace, there's our tower, there's the bridge and the river. I mean, one doesn't know how accurate this is, and I've had a look at it, and I think, I can't say for sure, but I think that's the Leighton Library, because it would have opened just a few years before this drawing was done. And I'm looking at the other buildings, and there's nothing else that looks particularly like it. So I think that's the best imaginary image we can get of the library shortly after it opened. And this is great. Gordon did a cartoon of what the library must have looked like when it opened. So we know, of course, that Leighton's books, there were 1,400 of them sent up, were just along the wall, where they are still today. There was a fireplace at that end, and also the fireplace that we exposed during the restoration and renovated. And of course, to get the light, you had to have the reading desks along where the windows were, now looking over the manse garden. And I mean, the other thing that would have been noticeable here was that outside would have been a very noisy marketplace. And we know from the minutes that there was quite a dispute between a lady who was selling pots and pans out on the pavement and the church about who owned which bit of pavement outside the Leighton Library, and we're probably still arguing in the council about that sort of thing. And here's a very nice picture from the museum. So I'm not sure about the date, somewhere between about 1822 and 1840, watercolour which is in the museum. So you can see here, and we actually used this to prove that there were crow steps at the south end, because as we'll see in a minute, you'll know that the Victorians removed 1 set of crow steps at one end. There's the 4th stair, and you can see that there were a lot of 4 stairs. There are only, I think, 2 left now. But interestingly, this building now demolished, some sort of gateway into the kirkyard, and then other buildings here. And originally, buildings went all the way around what is just now the boundary of the graveyard. So I think that's quite an interesting, and you can see the roof was not there. So the reason I think this is, well, we know that there was a house here adjoining, which I'll cover in a minute, to the right of the library as you're looking at it, which was demolished about 1820. So it must be after then, because there's a tree there instead of the house that used to be there. And this is actually a photo from before the restoration, but and you'll all be familiar with it if you've been inside the library. And we were very much at pains not to do anything other than freshen it up and improve the heating for the interior of the library room. It would not have been appropriate to start tinkering with stuff, so we've really tried to keep it in the traditional layout as much as possible. And a couple of photos of what it looked like before we started. So we had Jerry's wonderful bequest, which was sitting in the bank account. The trustees had been talking for some time about what they were going to do. Colin Rennick told me that one solution was a coat of paint on the stonework. Fortunately, that wasn't a solution that got pursued. But when I got involved, which was before lockdown, a preliminary application had been put into Historic Environment Scotland for grant funding to do something to restore the building, which would involve a very long and complicated process. Really took about a couple of years with Historic Environment Scotland, but they did ultimately fund us to the tune of £188,000, but that was a hard won, £188,000, and took an awful lot of technical surveying and submissions, and you can't just write and ask for money. It's a lot more complicated than that. And you can see here, so they're the crow steps, which are long gone. The two chimneys are different because that was a rebuild in ashlar. This was bulging and looking pretty terrible here, and generally okay, but looking a bit tatty, really. And even worse, of course, you remember that's how it looked from the front side. And this bit always bothered me because it was really shocking. The cartouche was dirty, and everything was looking, particularly here, trees up against the building. It was crying out for something to be done. But the problem with old buildings like this is, once you go into them, you don't know what you're going to find till you get in there, and that was one of the big issues for us. You can see, for example, it was sort of holding together, but it was definitely needing some TLC. So once we got an initial grant funding in, which was for a slightly disappointing amount of about 117,000 grant, so we thought we had just about enough for the quite good quotation we got from Gillis and Farrell, the stonemasons, to get the major work done. And the proposition really was to take off all the cement harling, and many of you will know this, have a look and see what's underneath, fix the roof, fix the chimneys, and generally repair anything that looked a bit shaky. All had to be done by hand because no hot work or any machine tools were allowed, and an enormous amount of really manual undertaking. So there came the scaffolding, serious negotiations with the Rennicks about saving their trees in the garden because they were two lovely acers, which are safe and are looking beautiful. Right? We did keep our promises. And so that was the outside, and you'll probably remember that from the winter of 2022. But all the negotiations took so long that we started a bit too late in the year, and it wasn't really ideal to start over the winter to do this sort of thing, because a lot, particularly lime work, is massively sensitive to frost. So, and of course, any really frosty days stop all the workmen doing anything. We did have a debate about whether we should leave the books in the library room, and unfortunately we decided not to do that. So we had them all packed up. I had to do a tendering process with specialist removal firms, and they were packed up into umpteen crates and taken away, and then we sealed up the bookcases and left that for the work to go on. So all the books went off to Clyde Bank after an enormous amount of negotiation with the insurers and all the rest of it. It had to be temperature controlled, humidity and all the rest of it. And the cost for that was a significant item, as Chris Onslow could testify because he really got cross about it, was about £900 a month to store the books. And as we got through the project, which we thought might take 6 to 8 months, we found that not only did the costs double, but the time taken would double as well. And that was a bit like having a taxi outside your house with a meter running. So every month's delay in the building work cost us almost another £1,000 just in storage costs before the builders came in and found something else. So it got a bit nerve-wracking at one stage. Now what we had to do was we had to go back to HES and say, look, we've discovered some serious problems with the building, because I'm sure many of you know the trapped water inside had really damaged. You couldn't see it until you exposed it, but the trapped water inside had really turned the mortar into sand, and a lot of the sandstone into just big lumps of crumbly stuff that really couldn't be... I think ultimately the building would have fallen down at some stage if we'd done nothing about it. Just after we packed the books up, we also packed up our chairs because they were mentioned in the establishment of the library in the late 1600s. So there were 12 chairs of Turkey leather. Now, they all went off to be looked after as well because they're ancient antiques. And about a month after we sent them off to Clydebank to the storage, the head of furniture at the National Museum of Scotland got hold of me and said he urgently needed to photograph one of our chairs. And I just had them all taken away and wrapped up in storage. And the reason that he wanted to do that was he was writing a book on important Scottish furniture. And it turns out that we, unknowingly, are sitting on some enormously important furniture, because if you think about it, these are Jacobean oak chairs, and almost no Jacobean oak chairs nowadays are still in their original setting. They've all been moved around, sold, relocated, and all the rest of it. So these are original Scottish chairs in the original Scottish setting, and of some great significance. The other issue was, of course, 6 out of the 12 are copies. They're extremely good copies, but they're probably Victorian, and it's a devil of a job to work out which ones are the original and which ones are the copies. And so I said to the guy, well, you can go down there. I got hold of Dorry Bonner, the removal people, and said, would you let them in? And they were fantastic. They facilitated everything. And that's actually the official photo that appears in the book that was taken down at the storage. But I did say to the guy, well, first of all, you've got to go to Clydebank, then you've got to get them out of storage, and then you've got to make sure you've got a real one and not, not a fake. But I said, well, you are the head of furniture at the National Museum, so I'm assuming you know what you're doing. And he did, and he was very happy, and the book has appeared. But I think we didn't really realise that we were sitting on also some important furniture. So this is my favourite fissure in the building. This is off the north side. I actually stuck my arm in there up to my armpit. And the problem with the north side, i.e. the wall of the library facing us here, above it, was that it was a party wall with an adjoining building. So the other 3 walls were exterior walls, which were pretty stout. But this one had been an interior wall, and then it had to be patched up when they demolished the other building. And unfortunately for that, meant loads of extra layers of harling, so the stuff was like absolute concrete. But when we got underneath it, that's the sort of problem that we found, and that's what really caused our cost to double and the price to go up. And you can see here, this is a bit more of the north wall. So apart from, you can see the condition once the harling comes off. I mean, they're basically holding themselves up, these stones. But we did find some really interesting things. So there's the burglar alarm. There's a new one on there now. But all you could see was that sticking out of the harling. But we found this wonderful lintel. There's a beautiful fireplace there, which was obviously from the demolished house. There were other fireplaces. We found a chimney that we didn't know, which was obviously a party chimney with the demolished house. And we even found the back of an old press, which had belonged to the demolished house, still with its lime plaster lining inside. So there was some archaeological interest in what we found. But it was quite and of course that makes things more complicated, and there are more people to consult and to deal with. And then this one here, it sort of looks worse than it really was. But we knew that the roof was generally original. Some of the manside had been restored. But you can see from the top, those are the original timbers. And with the best will in the world, they've been there 335 years, and they're going to let in a bit of rot and a bit of woodworm. One of the problems was and you can see as the slates came off, a lot of them just crumbled because they were in pretty terrible condition. So Gillis and Farrell, thankfully, hunted around, and even before the work started, Chris Onslow and I ended up going off to buy 6,000 slates before we'd even started the work, and they had to be stored off-site. But it's so difficult to get hold of original slates. These were old Aberfoyle green slates. So they were the right slates from the right local quarry, now long gone, but Aberfoyle was an enormous slate quarry in its day. And Aberfoyle greens were what were originally on there, and we managed to get some antique Aberfoyle green slates, 6,000 of them. It's a great stroke of luck. So well done Gillis and Farrell on doing that, but we had to go and buy them and store them at their yard until we were ready to go. And even when we did it, we had to even buy some more, but they managed to source some more further on in the project. So we were very lucky with that, but it does mean we've got a completely correct roof with the right slates. And I'm sure you'll agree a bit later, it looks absolutely beautiful. We've had to keep one of the timbers. I've got a few in the undercroft at the moment, because they have wooden nails inside them. So they've got these lovely 3-inch wooden nails holding them together, and they are of archaeological interest, and we're required to keep some for the archaeological record. And there is actually a comprehensive archaeological account of the whole of the restoration. Because unfortunately, we didn't really have any paperwork when we started, so we had to start from ground zero with it. And then here, another one of my favourites, as we knocked down the chimney on the north end, we found this stone with MGK carved on it. Now this was just basically the base of the chimney, and just a bit of recycled stone. Presumably it had come from somewhere else and was just being reused. A bit of a chat with Gordon, and we thought about it, and we worked out we know exactly who MGK was. So, and there he is. It's Gaspar Kelly. Now, this is the 1691 foundation document, the manuscript. We still have it. It's over at Stirling for safekeeping at Stirling Library. But it's an account by Bishop Douglas and Gaspar Kelly of the building of the library. It doesn't give us enough detail to sort out our problems with the title of the land, but it gives a very good account of who did what under the guidance of Lord Strathallan and his factor, how much they tipped the stonemasons, who did what and when, and all the rest of it. So that was done in 1691 as a record of what had happened, and there was Gaspar Kelly. Now he was the Dean of Dunblane in 1674, and what happened to him was he lived in the demolished house next door. He was deprived in 1689, because you'll know that the Glorious Revolution happened. 1688, William and Mary turned up, and there was an enormous amount of turmoil between the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians, and there was pretty much an arm wrestle as for who was going to control the kirk. And ultimately Presbyterianism prevailed, and a lot of the Episcopalians were turfed out, and that meant that our man Gaspar, who was obviously important enough to have his initials carved over his doorway, was disenfranchised. But we know from the record that he did carry on living in Dunblane for 3 years, because some people got disenfranchised in a rather violent way, but it doesn't seem to have happened to him. And we know that he then pops up in Edinburgh at the Netherbow near John Knox's house, running an Episcopalian meeting house, until he appears to disappear about the age of 70, and he still hadn't signed up. So all the Episcopalians were required to sign a kind of oath of allegiance to the new regime, and those that didn't got into trouble, and he wasn't for having it. But there we are. We have a very nice link with Gaspar Kelly, who was the Dean of Dunblane. Right, I'll move on to the building a bit now, and then we'll go on to the books. So you'll have seen Tom's great pictures at the back there as well of the cartouche. This was almost a separate project in itself. This was what it looked like before we started. Wonderful bit of carving. This was produced, Lord Strathallan organised it, but it was actually paid for and produced by the executors. That was the light makers in London, where Leighton's sister was the widow of a wealthy brewer from the City of London. And we know that it's entirely a lump of marble, although it doesn't quite look like marble as you'd understand it, but there it is. It's beautifully carved, and it was carved within the City of London in the 1680s. It's possible even this could have been the workshop of Grinling Gibbons, who was in that area at the time, but there were several very accomplished monumental carvers at the time. So it was not anything that could have been carved in Scotland. It was brought up, especially from London, at huge expense. So up it went on the wall, and sometime, we think in the 20th century, the top bit here had been replaced, not very effectively, with some new stonework, but the effect of that had been that it had diverted the rainfall in an unfortunate way onto the face of the cartouche. Now, you can see here that after the restoration, we've even had, you can see that's got rather sharp, angular, doesn't really fit look to it. we've got a much more beautifully carved, more faithful to the original bit of carving there. And here's the cartouche, which has been cleaned up. So what happened was that a lot of pollution and sulphurization and just general Scottish weather over 300 years had given the thing a bit of a beating, but it's still in pretty good condition. But it was suffering from hairline cracks and generally in need of some restoration, but very minor restoration. We didn't want to rebuild this thing. And it went to Graciela Ainsworth, who you may have seen at the Cathedral 18 months ago, who is probably the best person in Scotland to deal with things like this. So back it came, and here it is, restored in situ. Now, I was always worried about the cartouche because I thought that went up in the 1680s. It will have had iron fixings. They've probably rusted through, and some innocent passerby on their way to Bennett's is going to find that this is going to land on their head one day and we'll have an awful lot of paperwork. So, as it turned out, it took them a week to get the thing off. And the people who'd installed it in the 1680s did an absolutely astonishing job. It was really difficult to get the thing off. There was one iron bar that went in about over a metre into the stonework, so it was never going to fall off. It would have withstood nuclear attack. So getting it off, and then it spent a long time in the workshop being cleaned up and restored and the hairline cracks being dealt with. They then had to work out a way of putting it back up there. And so a new design had to be thought up by the structural engineers of how we were going to fix it back, because Ross couldn't use the original fixings. The first set of designs were rejected by us and by the architect because they weren't really suitable. And then they came up with this idea, which is 3 new pins that go into essentially hollow tubes set into the wall, so you can actually lift the thing out and put it in again, a bit like putting a Christmas tree on a building, which is a great idea because it also future-proofs restoration of the cartouche, or if we do have to take it down because it deteriorates, we can actually move it this time without... the problem with trying to bash it out for a week with original cast iron fixings is you're terrified you're going to crack it. And it's one solid, enormous chunk of marble. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And there they are, and they spent a lot of time just on the fine planning of it. Now, one interesting thing that was done that Celia did was, I think she read an article somewhere that there is a new type of archaeology going on now, which is really done by lasers and 3D technology. And that enables you to do all sorts of things that you can't do physically. And so what we arranged, and Celia got some funding for it, was to have a laser scan of the cartouche whilst it was being restored, and you could get round the back of it, which we would keep as an electronic image, which you could then display in whatever display system we decide to choose, and give people a good idea. So here's an example of what they've come up with from Wessex Archaeology. Now, interesting here, can you see it says Bibliotheca Leightoniana? You can't see that on the stonework, but the laser scanning did actually show the very small indentation of the original engravings, which would have been, we think, gilded, painted lettering. There's also some paint traces, particularly we know that the mitre was painted in gold. It was also repainted in Victorian times, probably slightly inappropriately. And then here, this is speculation, but I think the feeling is that this is probably, this is the coat of arms of the Leightons of Usan. Now, Leighton himself did not have a coat of arms, we think deliberately so, because he was a person of great humility. He didn't register a coat of arms, despite being an archbishop and a national figure. But that would have been his family crest, and in fact, his brother, who's buried alongside him in Sussex, has that very emblem on his gravestone. But the problem about coats of arms is that they're personal, so your brother's coat of arms is not your coat of arms. So, to cut a very long story short, we've had a big debate. We're not going to repaint it because we don't really know what's what, and the specialist advice is don't go starting to tart up things, just leave them in their natural state and conserve them. Don't restore them in case you end up, I don't know if anyone's been to the palace in Knossos in Crete, but you can see what happens when someone goes bad with a tin of red paint, and you don't really want to do that. Right, so this is the books coming back. Now, I can see quite a few of the doughty souls who were fantastic in this team are with us today, and nothing but admiration for them. We spent quite a few days sorting this out. So the books came back in the crates. They'd all been individually wrapped in acid-free paper during their storage. They had to be brought in 4 batches, lids off and left to acclimatise for at least 24 hours before we could take them out. We then had to work out how to do it in order, because this was only one delivery. We had 4 deliveries of that size and we'd already filled the floor space. So logistically it was quite interesting to work out. We started filling the books in backwards and doing them in 4 batches, but at least took a week for each one to do. And then we had a conveyor belt of fantastic volunteers there's Gordon there. And essentially it was an unwrap, and then there was a bit of a cleaning and a check. Then they went to Gordon, who did a condition check on each volume. I think the first time that probably 4,700 volumes had been looked at individually and recorded as to their condition. And then photographed, mostly by Tom. So that's 2 photos, 4,700 times, of the cover and the front page. Now the problem with that was, it was so interesting that I had to stop them all, because they were finding great images and books. Come on, we've got to keep this going or we're going to be here for another year. But we eventually did it, so we've now got a condition report on every volume, and we've checked every one, and they've all been cleaned and looked after and gone back. And we've also checked them against the catalogue to see if there's anything missing. Some are missing, but we knew about those. But we've done a proper audit of the books. Now the condition report shows that we have just under 70 books which are in serious danger of, or either covers come off already or they're in a bad state, what we call red. And then we've got about a couple of hundred of ambers. So we're now going to start on a project for restoring some of the books. We do have some dedicated funds for doing that, and we'll start doing the restoration. So an amazing exercise, but it did turn out to be extremely worthwhile for conservation reasons as well as presentation. And if you've been in, you'll know that we've now got this rather striking portrait of Leighton. This is from 1662, when he was principal of Edinburgh University. I managed to get this from the principal. I emailed the principal of Edinburgh University and said, our library has got a guy who used to be one of your predecessors, and I know you've got an image of him in your art collection. Would you pay for a copy of this thing? And he was only too pleased to do it. So I went off to an art printer in Edinburgh, got a very high resolution copy of the original painting, who was by a man called Schumann in 1662, and a bit more to come on Viscount Strathallan by the same artist. But we know that this is a definite portrait of him, whereas you're probably familiar, if you know, there are a lot of sort of engravings of Leighton that all look a bit samey and are mostly reproductions of another engraving. And interestingly here, a pewter inkwell, normally as principal and professor of divinity, he would have had an enormously elaborate silver inkwell, but this is again to signify, as these portraits often did, Leighton's humility. And then in his hand, a very small personal copy of the Imitation of Christ, his favourite book that he generally carried around in his pocket. We have about 7 or 8 copies of it. And some of them have his own signature and handwriting and his notes in various languages in the marginalia. Now, normally Gordon tells us that you would have expected a prominent person from Edinburgh University to have a large pile of very large books to signify their erudition and learning, and this was deliberately done by Leighton to show his humility and his Christian approach to life. Didn't go down necessarily well with everybody, because this was, the Imitation of Christ, whilst it's an enormously popular book that's been reprinted for several hundred years and still widely read today, in that period, in the 1660s, it was a bit controversial because it had a bit of a whiff of Catholicism around it, and it was quite popular with the Jesuits, but equally it was very popular with Charles Wesley later in life, so it's appealed to all sorts of people. But it was, in itself, as a lot of things were in the 17th century, potentially a bit controversial for theological reasons. And we've managed to identify the very book, and there it is. So as you can see the matching of the thing. This is the one, you look at the other ones, it's definitely this one, which I think is an English version from about 1640. So we've taken that out and put it in a special case underneath the portrait, because I think there's something magic about having the portrait with the real thing from the 1662 portrait underneath it. And here we are. I love this. So this is William Drummond, Lord Strathallan. It's again by the same artist, Schünemann, who was a German who painted in Edinburgh in the late 1600s. I love this because he's almost a stylised medieval knight. You can see there's appears to be a sort of jousting tournament, field of the cloth of gold going on in the background. So William Drummond, we've now got his portrait over the door. I didn't get this one for nothing. I found the portrait's in the National Gallery collection, but it's not on display. And they have a very bad photographic reproduction of it on their website, and you have to pay 100 quid for the rights to copy it, which is a bit annoying. Especially as it's such a terrible photo. But I went back to my art printer and got him to doctor it with a bit of photoshopping. And this is the horrible yellowish version. You can see the real one is much nicer. But there he is, so William Drummond. The reason we're showing him is, of course, he knew Leighton, and he really oversaw the building of the library after Leighton's death on behalf of the executors. He appointed his factor, you may well know this, and even stored the books in his townhouse opposite until things were ready to be installed in there. So he's a really interesting character. So he was either present. Now, the first thing is, he's one of the Drummonds of Innerpeffray. He's actually buried in Innerpeffray. And I think he may have been the brother of David Drummond, who was the guy who set up the library in Innerpeffray 10 years before the Leighton Library. He knew Leighton and made his money in Russia. So what happened with him was that he was a royalist. He either was at the execution of Charles I or saw the scaffold the day before and decided to leg it to the continent, quite wisely, where he stayed for a bit. He then came back with Charles II in 1651, was captured at the Battle of Worcester, taken to Windsor Castle, where amazingly he escaped. He then went back to Europe again and then made his fortune with Tandiel of the Binns, working for the Tsar of Muscovy as a soldier. Started off as a colonel and ended up as a major general and the governor of Smolensk. but of course, a lot of Scots did make their living as soldiers in Europe at that time, so it was not an uncommon thing. Made an enormous amount of money, and at the Restoration, Charles II wanted him back because he was the sort of soldier that he really needed, and the Tsar wouldn't really let him go. So there was quite a lot of discussion before they persuaded the Tsar to let him come back. And when he came back, he and Tandiel were rather proud of having brought back the thumbscrews as a handy bit of kit they'd spotted in Europe whilst on their work, which could come in useful when they were back in Scotland. The contemporary accounts say he had rather a lot of the air of Russia about him. So what I've read about him is that he was pretty lively, told you what he thought, and you didn't really want to mess with him. So anyway, so he's back as the head of the Scottish Army when he now knows Leighton in the 1660s. He becomes the Lord of Cromlix and presumably brought all his money back from Russia and started buying a bit more property. And quite a significant figure in our library. He then fell out with the Duke of Lauderdale. Do you remember I mentioned him at the start, that we didn't want to cross this man who was the Secretary of State of Scotland, and found himself in his late 60s a prisoner in Dumbarton Castle for 12 months on trumped-up charges of having apparently corresponded with Covenanters. But he was eventually released. He died at the age of 70 and is buried in Innerpeffray. So quite an important character. So we thought it was important to have this picture in the library, just because it gives us some excellent context. Right, now I'm going to just go through some books. I'm going to do 4 books that I particularly like, and you may well know them. So this one, of course, is Munster's Cosmographia, which a lot of the guides like to show because it is so wonderful and so pictorial. And it suffers a bit from overhandling as a result. And I was looking at it recently, and actually some of the pages, somebody in the past has cut out some of the illustrations with a razor blade, which is really, we don't know when, but certainly some time ago. So it was published in 1544, Copies of these images can be bought on mouse mats at Celia's merchandising stall at the end of the talk, if you like. And you may be more interested in them after I've told you about them. So here we have, the interesting thing about the Cosmographia was that we have a Latin version, which was published sometime in the early 1550s, but there were 24 editions of this book published over 100 years, massively popular because it was the first kind of encyclopedia to the world outside the small place that you lived in those times. And it's very important in terms of cartography. And we know that the maps have been removed from the book and are now shown separately in protective plastic, but they are particular interest to visitors because they're just so lively. So let's just have a look at them. So this is what's called the Ptolemaic projection. So Ptolemy was a Greek Hellenistic cartographer who was sort of rediscovered in the 14th century and then kicked off. This, of course, coincided with a great era of exploration of the unknown world, and started off really thinking about maps and how the world was to be depicted. So this was the standard kind of Greek world's understanding of the world as they knew it. So they only really knew 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia. You've got the Indian Ocean here, which appears to be pretty much enclosed by land. We've got Taprobana here. Anybody care to hazard what Taprobana was? Yes, correct. Yeah, Sri Lanka. It's massively out of proportion. Why is it out of proportion? Because it was enormously important to the spice trade. So you can see, you can get an awful lot of very interesting history from these early maps. And here we have the Nile, and then we don't really know what goes on in the bottom half of Africa. We'll have a look at that in a minute. But this was the kind of known projection of the world at the start. Now Munster changed this because he is the first recorded person to have done individual continent maps. So that's what we have in the library, particularly the first known map of America. You may be familiar with it. It's got a great picture of cannibals in it, with people's legs chopped off, which I'll cover that in a minute as well. But so it's a very important book in terms of cartography. It makes us think. And this one is always interesting to visitors because they take a few seconds before they realise what on earth they're looking at. And who's to say that it's not the right way up? And of course it's quite accurate because the map makers came from this area and knew pretty much their own patch. The bit I like here is we've got Hibernia and Anglia, and I'm thinking, what have we got in Anglia then? Well, we've got Cornwall, we've got London with the Thames, and then hooray, look at that, there's the River Tweed. And then it says a bit of Scotland. So there we are, we're on the map. But isn't it wonderful? Absolutely great. And then this one is really fantastic. So you can tell quite obviously that the top half's in the scale and the bottom half isn't. Now, what happened there was, of course, that in the 1550s, explorers and map makers knew the coast of Africa quite well, but they had absolutely no idea about the interior. But they would know about North Africa, because that had obviously been occupied since the Romans, Barbary pirates and all the rest of it. But when you get down here, it all gets a bit hazy. So you can see, for example, here, you appear to have one-eyed people called the monoculi. And then you've got some parrots in a tree, and then there's a rather nice African elephant there. And here we have the Nile again, which seems to cover most of Africa with its sources, going up to Egypt where people know stuff. So what happened here was that because Munster and his fellow map makers didn't know anything about what was going on in the interior, they had to rely on classical sources. And so Munster was really working on reports recorded by Herodotus and Pliny the Elder, and nothing more contemporary than that. And interestingly, I found a quote from Jonathan Swift in 1733, poking fun at this shortcoming in cartography. So I'll quote it. It says, so just bear in mind what we're looking at here. So geographers in Afric maps with savage pictures fill their gaps. And o'er uninhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns. So there we are. So you may, if you're a volunteer, you may have looked at that map for a long time. I hope you'll look at it differently now. And here's an absolute favourite. Now, this is from the Cosmographia, and if you do go to the uninhabitable downs of southern Africa, this is what you're going to meet. Right? So now this one here is a skier-pod. Now, if you know any Greek, skier is shadow and pod is foot. So this is the one-footed person who can relax in the shadow of his very large foot. There's the monoculus, or monocular, I don't know which. The two-headed child. The dog-headed man. And this one here, the wonderfully called Blemmy, the headless man whose head is in his chest. Now, Blemmies are really interesting. If you look at, and I know Dan's done this, if you go to the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, you will find Blemmies on the Mappa Mundi. And Blemmy is a mythological part of Africa where these creatures live. And so 250 years before Munster, Blemmies were known. And in fact, Blemmies feature, I've done a bit of research on this, in Japanese mythology, Chinese mythology, in the Ramayana and Zoroastrianism. They even appear in Shakespeare. They're mentioned in Othello and in The Tempest. Cannibals that each other eat, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. So Blemmies are really quite interesting, and they appear all over the classical world, and they generally, even Sir Walter Raleigh was told in South Africa, in South America, he met people who said they had seen Blemmies. I'm not sure that anyone's ever met one, but they were definitely believed in that period. And then just some other slightly random, there are so many images in the Cosmographia that I just love. That's Erasmus, and the quality of the engraving, I just love that expression. It's a kind of so what type of expression, isn't it? And then this one here is even more extraordinary. This is a kind of naked jacuzzi party in a fountain. All from the Cosmographia. You have to decipher all the Latin to work out what on earth this is illustrating. But here we are, he's playing the flute, there's a few drinks, there's some naked people, a bit of a row going on there. But there you are, I leave you to draw your own conclusions. And I even found someone playing the bagpipes in the Cosmographia as well. Now, I'm going to try a bit of technology here, because this is another one of my favourite books. This is called The History of the Holy War by Thomas Fuller. Now, Thomas Fuller lived up 1608 to 1661. He was a friend of Samuel Pepys, quite a well-known character and actually a really famous writer in his day. So we have got an enormous bestseller. This was a complete runaway bestseller in its day, and we have a copy in the library. And so in 1639, it was absolutely the top book. Now, Thomas Fuller is considered to be one of the first professional writers in the early modern period. So a lot of the books we have in the Bishop's collection were academic things written by clerics and all the rest of it. Fuller was a cleric himself, but he actually made his living from writing. And he wrote, I've got another one at home called England's Worthies. He's actually very funny. He's very witty. Even as a child, he was described as having pregnant wit. Somebody said he had such a commanding and imperious style that everyone disliked it, except himself. And then somebody else said that, so I can find it, you could often find Fuller running around London with his big book under one arm and his little wife under the other, and recommending himself as a dinner guest by his facetious talk. He was a very popular preacher. He was said to have had two congregations, one in the church and the other outside looking in through the windows. And another person who navigated very skillfully between the parliamentarians being in power and the royalists being in power, another great survivor. And even he died in Covent Garden in his lodgings, apparently crying out for his pen and ink to the last. Now, the reason I like this book is not particularly about the contents of the Holy War, which is a fairly kind of biased description of the pointlessness of what Catholics get up to, which is really what it's all about. But when we were doing that assessment process, came across this absolutely wonderful frontispiece, and I've got another wonderful frontispiece. I'm going to try, if I can, just to bring it up a bit more closely. It's testing my technology a bit. Right, here we go. Right, here we go. Yeah. So, history of the Holy War. If this council be of men, it will come of naught. So you can see Europe is the church at the top, and there are two pots of money. There's we went out full, and then on the top right, but we returned empty. So the purpose of this was to describe, it's a history of the Crusades, but really from the point of view of what an enormous waste of time and life this was, and just shows you what happens when the Catholics start doing things. So we've got, you can see here a journey. So he then says, look at that, they've even got the halt and the lane going out on the crusade. So we have kings going on the crusade, followed by the knights, followed by the bishops, followed by the monks. He says the monks will be useful because their bald pates can be used as war drums if you whack them on the head. Then we have some soldiers, then we have some women folk, and then we've got the halt and the lame, who says they're hardly going to be able to run away if it ever gets a bit nasty. And then, I'm just let this work again. And then, so here we have the king. Here's the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Here's Peter the Hermit. Now, I had to look up Peter the Hermit. He was apparently the cause of some of these crusades. Had a bit of a vision, and then everyone rushed off to the Holy Land after what Peter the Hermit came up with, which probably wasn't that prudent. And then as we go back up the Turkish side, because we've got the Christian side here, and then you've got the Turkish side here, we have heaven, earth, and hell. So here's an archangel dishing out death. Then we have the Turk dishing out death, and then we have death himself dishing out death. And then back we go to square one into the church, and it was all to naught. So you don't need to read the book because you get the whole story on the front page. Now, and that's just one page, and I'll on the thing. Now, if I can just get that back. Right, I've got another one now, which is very similar, and I really like. I won't try and muck about with this one. So this is Gilbert Burnet, who was quite well known to Leighton, was actually Professor of Divinity at Glasgow in the 1660s, and was Leighton's right-hand man, in inverted commas, when he was Archbishop in Glasgow, when they were trying to promote reconciliation between Covenanters, Episcopalians and all the rest of it, and generally failed in doing so. But it wasn't for the want of trying, and Burnet was said to have been heavily influenced by Leighton with Leighton's approach to reconciliation between the various denominations. But he was also a bit of a writer. He also had to leave Scotland because he fell out with the Duke of Lauderdale, there's another one, and had to go abroad for a bit, but then he came back. And so this book was first published in 1679, and it was an absolutely enormous bestseller, History of the English Reformation. It was so popular that he was personally commended in both Houses of Parliament for his fine work. And again, it's another one where you don't need to read the book, because you can just look at the frontispiece and you get the whole story. As it says, it's abridged. Well, it definitely is. So if you have a look at it, and I don't just like it because of the illustration. Henry VIII, Cranmer, papal jewellery on the ground, dissolution of monasteries, there's a chap chucking some stuff off the roof. Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, didn't live very long, came to the throne at the age of 9, died at the age of 15. But he actually sort of firmed up the Protestant. I don't think Henry VIII was that interested in Protestantism. He was more interested in getting divorced. But the Protestantism was taken forward by the very pious Edward VI, who banned the Mass, for example. Unfortunately then, although he nominated Lady Jane Grey as his successor, we know she didn't last very long, And Mary turned up, who was of stern stuff, and there she is, and there's a monk with his rosary, and look what's happening to anybody who crosses Mary. So there's Latimer and Ridley, and there's old Cranmer. Now, she had it in for Cranmer particularly because he was the one that got Henry divorced from Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. So he was then, he was for the chop, so he got burnt, and you may be familiar with this famous story of Cranmer's hand. What you could do was recant before they burnt you, and if you did recant, then possibly they wouldn't go ahead and execute you. He did recant, but Mary decided that he should be burnt anyway. And so when he was being burnt, that was the hand in which he signed his recantation, which he deliberately placed into the flames as he went up. Horrible way to go. And then Bloody Mary, she got rid of about 700 people that way. And then here we have Elizabeth I, who established a kind of more reasonable amount of Protestantism. And that's all you need to know about the English Reformation. So it's absolutely fantastic what you can get in the Leighton Library. And here's my last book. You'll all know what this is. It's a great favourite. So we've got the second Edinburgh edition from 1786. Now this cost 5 shillings for subscribers. There's a big list of them, mostly the Caledonian Hunt, in the front of the book, and 6 shillings if you're a non-subscriber. And they decided to print 1,500. Now the Kilmarnock edition, which was the very first one, which was locally printed when Burns started off, we think there were 618 of the Kilmarnock editions, and there are only 88 of those still known. Now we haven't got that one, but curses, they've got one in Inner Peffray in their display. It's worth going to see because it's such a rarity. But the one we have is quite a rarity as well, and of course it's been restored after a huge amount of handling by the previous Dunblane Burns Club. Thank you very much. So this one came out in 1786. As I say, they were going to have 1,500 copies, but they then realised there was such a demand they had to double that, and they went to 3,000. Printed in Edinburgh, it was twice as long as the earlier one, and it had some new poems in it, including this one. So this one doesn't appear in the Kilmarnock. This is the first time this appears, plus things like Death and Dr. Hornbrook and one or two others that do appear in this much longer version. And the interesting thing about this one is, apart from the fact it's beautifully printed, you can even see on the page the intaglio of the printing. It's absolutely lovely. But actually the printing was very sloppy because of the demand. William Smellie, the Edinburgh printer, was a bit pushed because he was already trying to produce a Gaelic Bible and a Hebrew grammar book. So he had to jam in the extra demand for the bigger print of the second edition. And there are some typographical errors in this second edition, which purists worry about. So, interestingly, one of them is called the Stinking edition. So in this poem, there's the word skinking, which is an old Scots word that really means a kind of watery, like common skink, it's a kind of watery soup. But the typographer's written stinking instead of skinking. So it's a bit of a collector's one if you can find that. And the other interesting thing about this one is that originally they weren't going to have that lovely portrait in the book, which we've got. But when they got to the 3,000, they decided it would be a good idea to stick a portrait in as well. So they then looked around for an artist, and they found Naismith. Now, if you know Naismith, whose most famous painting is a construction of Princes Street in the National Gallery, he was a landscape painter, so he wasn't terribly keen on doing a head and shoulders, but he was prevailed upon to do so, and after a bit of a grumpy start, he really hit it off with Burns and became a great friend of his. He didn't actually finish the portrait because, of course, first of all, it had to be a picture that then turned into an engraving to go onto the plate. So the painting bit of it, he didn't really finish, and it was handed on to an engraver to finish off for the print run. He refused to take any payment for his work as an artist, and actually gave the original to Jean Armour, which I think is quite a sweet thing. But the engraver carried on, finished it off, and did this absolutely wonderful engraving. Now, Burns rather regretted signing over the copyright of this book to William Creech, the publisher. He got some royalties, but he didn't have the copyright, and he suspected that Creech was secretly printing off a load more and flogging them without giving Burns the royalties for them. So he went to the engraver and said, look, give me the plate back, because if you give it to me, he won't be able to do it, because he won't have the picture in the book. The engraver wouldn't do that, but the engraver put some kind of secret mark in the engraving. Now, I don't know what it is, so I can't show it to you. But it was put in there to show which one was, you know, one of Creature's dodgy copies. Anyway, there are plenty of Creature's dodgy copies about, because he still carried on selling them despite the thing. So Burns was a bit unhappy with the commercial arrangements for this book, but of course it became massively popular, and it's really one of the most popular books that we have in the library. Right, I'm just coming to the end now, so you'll have all seen it, but this is really pretty much what it looks like at the moment. We've still to do the undercroft, which is another talk for another day. That door will be opened up, and the other great question, of course, is, are we going to leave the stonework, or is it going to be hard? The answer is, it has to be hard. If you look very carefully at the stonework, as particularly here, it's not actually much stone, it's mostly lime mortar. And that is, it's breathable, which is why we do it, but it's still vulnerable, and it is a requirement of our grant to actually cover it with what turns out to be a rather complicated technical process for lime washing, which that man over there is going to be managing. Alan Clevet's got the pleasure of sorting that out, probably in a year, 18 months, 2 years' time, subject to negotiation. It's technically quite a difficult question, but it will not really be as you see it now, and we can't. It's one of the, they'll claw back our £188,000 if we don't do it, so we can't really afford to do that. So other than that, I'll just finish off. We opened in May this year. We used to get 1,500 visitors a year for the 2 hours a day that we were open. We've now been open, thanks to lots of great volunteering, for 5 hours a day. And by the end of October, we've had over 4,000 visitors, with an increase in donations, loads more interest. And I think a lot of people in the town have noticed us that maybe walked past before and hadn't really paid attention to it. So I can't think Jerry could have had a better epitaph than that, because it's completely enhanced the town. That's her memory there forevermore, and what an enhancement to everybody's life. It's really good. Plus the protection of what is one of the most important book collections in Scotland that we had under our noses as a bit of an undiscovered treasure. I didn't really appreciate what we had, and we're still finding interesting stuff about it. And there's a nice one I took from the Manse Garden, with those lovely preserved aces. Don't they look nice? But you can see here, look how the crow steps have gone back, and it really does look splendid. So it's something we can be really proud of. So thank you very much for listening. I hope it's whetted your appetite to come and have a look at the collection. I'm just going to finish off with a 2-minute film, which you may or may not have seen before, but we have it on the website. Get it to play. Which is, Gillis and Farrell sent a drone up just to have a look at what it's like. It gives us a nice view of the context of the library. There it is. Anyway, thank you very much. Right, that's it. Thank you very much.